When the lawyer handed Nora the deed, her cousin smirked. He inherited the $14 million estate. She received a barren patch of Wyoming dirt and a rusted, dried-up well. They called it a final insult. They called her crazy for staying, but when the deadliest blizzard in a century hit, that worthless well became the only thing keeping them alive. The mahogany-paneled office of Sterling and Hayes smelled of floor wax and old money. Nora Campbell sat rigidly in a leather chair that felt too expensive for her frayed coat. Across from her sat her cousin, Derek Pendleton, casually checking his Rolex. At 32, Nora was drowning. Her mother, Arthur Pendleton's estranged daughter, had passed away a year prior, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt that had systematically devoured Nora's life. She had lost her apartment, her car was on the verge of repossession, and her credit score was a smoking crater. Her grandfather's death was supposed to be the lifeboat. Instead, it was an anchor. Richard Sterling, a lawyer with a voice as dry as autumn leaves, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. To my grandson, Derek Pendleton, I leave the entirety of Pendleton Logistics, the Aspen estate, and the contents of all liquid accounts. To my granddaughter, Nora Campbell, I leave Parcel 42A in Bitter Creek, Wyoming, and the structure upon it. May she find the same value in it that she provided to this family. Derek let out a low, breathless chuckle. A dirt patch? He left you the old bootlegger dirt patch? Christ, Nora, I'm almost sorry. Nora's hands trembled as she took the manila envelope containing the deed. It was 2 acres of jagged limestone in one of the most unforgiving corners of the American West. And the structure the will mentioned? It was a 19th century artesian well that had run dry before Nora was even born. Desperation makes people do irrational things. 3 days later, Nora drove her sputtering 2012 Honda Civic across the state line into Wyoming. The landscape of Bitter Creek was brutalist nature at its finest, endless sweeps of grey sagebrush, cracked earth, and a wind that felt like physical blows against the windshield. She met with a local real estate agent, a pragmatic woman named Brenda Hollis, in a diner that smelled of stale grease and black coffee. I'll shoot to you straight, Nora, Brenda said, tapping a manicured nail against the property map. Parcel 42A is unsellable. The soil is too alkaline to farm, it's not zoned for commercial, and no one is building a residential home out near the ridge. The only thing on that land is the old Pendleton well. Your grandfather bought it in the 80s thinking there was oil beneath it. Nora felt the familiar, suffocating grip of panic in her chest. There has to be something. Brenda offered a sympathetic smile. I wouldn't list it for $500. Refusing to accept defeat, Nora drove out to the ridge. The property was exactly as described. Desolate, barren. In the center of a shallow depression sat the well. It was a massive ring of mortared fieldstone, covered by a heavy, rotting wooden lid bound in rusted iron. Nora approached it, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened earth. She grasped the iron handle of the lid and, with a massive heave, dragged it aside. The darkness inside was absolute. She picked up a jagged piece of limestone and dropped it in, waiting for the inevitable splash of stagnant water or the hard crack of a dry bottom. 1, 2, 3, 4. It didn't hit water. It hit stone. But as Nora leaned over the rim, the bitter Wyoming wind died down for a fraction of a second, and she felt it. Warmth, it wasn't a draft. It was a distinct, humid exhalation of air, smelling faintly of sulfur and wet earth. A steady hiss echoed from deep within the shaft. Nora unclipped her cheap LED flashlight and pointed it down. The beam caught the swirling mist rising from the depths. The well wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was breathing. Nora spent the next 48 hours in the Bitter Creek Public Library, fueled by vending machine coffee and sheer obsession. She pulled geological surveys, old mining maps, and county records. Bitter Creek, she discovered, sat on the extreme outer edge of a deep, dormant fault line. She needed an expert. She found one in Thomas Granger. Thomas was a retired geothermal engineer who had been blacklisted from the corporate energy sector a decade prior for blowing the whistle on a fracking operation. Now, he lived in a battered Airstream trailer on the edge of town, harboring a deep distrust of the world and a heavy reliance on cheap bourbon. It took Nora 3 days of showing up at his trailer to finally get him out to Parcel 42A. Thomas lowered a thermal probe down the stone shaft on a spool of high-tensile wire. He watched the digital reader in his hand, his cynical expression slowly giving way to utter shock. "I'll be damned," Thomas muttered, tapping the screen. "You didn't inherit a well, kid. You inherited a thermal chimney. There's a localized micro-geothermal vent about 90 feet down. Water from an underground aquifer is hitting a magma-heated rock bed, turning to steam, and venting straight up this shaft. The ambient temperature at the bottom of this well is a constant 85 degrees Fahrenheit. In the dead of winter, what can I do with that?" Nora asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. Thomas looked at the barren, freezing landscape. "If you cap it, it builds pressure. If you harness it, well, you'd have free, unlimited heat. You could build a greenhouse in the middle of a tundra." Nora didn't just want a greenhouse. She needed a home. She needed a fortress to weather the financial storm of her life. She and Thomas developed a wild blueprint. They wouldn't build over the well. They would dig around it. They would create a Walipini, an underground greenhouse and dwelling. By excavating the earth around the stone well and creating a subterranean, concrete-reinforced living space capped with an angled glass roof, the earth would act as natural insulation. The well itself would serve as the central heating column, radiating geothermal warmth through the structure. But building it required capital. Nora sold her Honda Civic. She drained the last $3,200 from her savings. She pawned her mother's wedding ring. When that wasn't enough, she maxed out 3 high-interest credit cards to buy concrete, reclaimed steel beams, and heavy-duty, double-paned polycarbonate glass from a bankrupt commercial nursery. She couldn't afford a construction crew. Instead, she hired 2 local high school dropouts, Jimmy and Leo, paying them in cash and daily lunches to help her dig. For 2 months, it was backbreaking, agonizing labor. They rented a small backhoe, excavating a massive 40 by 60 foot pit around the stone well. Descending 12 feet into the earth, Nora's hands blistered, calloused, and bled. Her muscles screamed in constant agony. Rumors in a small town spread faster than a wildfire. Word that Arthur Pendleton's disgraced granddaughter was digging a giant hole in the ground reached Denver. In late October, a sleek black Range Rover pulled up to the edge of the dirt road. Derek Pendleton stepped out, wearing a cashmere overcoat that cost more than Nora's entire excavation budget. He stood at the edge of the pit, looking down at Nora, who was covered in grey dust, tying rebar. "I thought it was a joke," Derek sneered, looking around at the trenches and the exposed stone of the well. "What do you want, Derek?" Nora asked, wiping sweat from her forehead with a filthy forearm. "I want to save you from yourself." Derek pulled a folded document from his coat. "I had my surveyors look at some old maps. There's a chance this worthless rock has deep water rights attached to it. I need those rights for a commercial bottling plant. I'm opening 100 miles south of here. I'll give you $20,000 for the deed right now. You can pay off your debt and crawl back to whatever hole you crawled out of." Nora looked at the check. $20,000 was a fortune to her. It was a lifeline. She looked back at the central stone well, radiating a faint, invisible heat. She looked at Thomas, who was watching her from the backhoe. "The land isn't for sale, Derek," Nora said, her voice steady. Derek's face hardened. His smirk vanished, replaced by the cold, ruthless glare of his grandfather. "I'll tie you up in mineral rights litigation until you're bankrupt. You won't survive the winter out here in a glass trench. You're going to freeze to death." He turned and marched back to his Range Rover, speeding off in a cloud of dust. By mid-November, the structure was enclosed. The concrete walls were poured, and the heavy polycarbonate roof was sealed, angled perfectly to catch the winter sun. Inside, it was a cavernous, dirt-floored bunker, but thanks to the open stone well in the center of the room, the ambient temperature inside the Walipini hovered at a perfect, humid 72 degrees, while the air outside dropped to a bitter 30. Nora moved her sleeping bag and a camping stove into the subterranean home. She began planting fast-yield crops, radishes, spinach, and dwarf tomatoes in raised beds circling the heat source. She thought the hardest part was over. She had beaten the dirt, the debt, and her cousin. But as November bled into December, the radio broadcasts in Thomas's trailer began to change tone. They were tracking a freak atmospheric anomaly, a collapsing polar vortex merging with an intense Pacific moisture plume. They were calling it the Siberian Express. The locals in Bitter Creek called it something else. They called it the White Death, and it was heading straight for them. The sky over Bitter Creek did not merely darken, it bruised. A deep, sickly violet hue spilled across the horizon on the afternoon of December 14th, accompanied by a sudden, unnatural stillness. The local radio station, normally a reliable stream of country music and farm reports, switched to a continuous, automated emergency broadcast. The National Weather Service issued a chilling warning. A stationary high-pressure system over the Arctic had shattered, sending a lobe of the polar vortex plunging straight into the Rocky Mountains. It was colliding with a supersaturated atmospheric river. The resulting blizzard was predicted to be a multi-day, historic catastrophe. Inside the Walipini, Nora felt the atmospheric pressure drop like a physical weight in her chest. She stood beneath the heavy polycarbonate glass roof, watching the first flakes fall. They were small, hard, and driven perfectly horizontal by a wind that was rapidly climbing to hurricane force. The genius of the Walipini design was about to be tested against an apocalyptic force of nature. Because the floor of her home was 12 feet below the frost line, the surrounding earth acted as a massive thermal battery, maintaining a constant temperature derived from the planet's core rather than the freezing surface. In the center, the old Pendleton well hissed softly, a steady exhalation of geothermal steam warming the ambient air. It was a perfect microcosm of survival. But Thomas Granger was not in the Walipini. Despite Nora's frantic pleas, the stubborn retired engineer had refused to leave his battered Airstream trailer on the edge of town. "I've weathered Wyoming winters since before you were born, kid," he had grumbled over the phone 2 hours earlier. "I've got full propane tanks and a case of bourbon. You just worry about keeping your glass roof from caving in." By nightfall, the temperature plummeted to 38 degrees below zero, with wind chills ripping past -70. The power grid across 3 counties failed catastrophically as ice-laden transmission towers snapped like dry twigs. Bitter Creek was plunged into absolute, freezing darkness. At 2 a.m., the wind howling over the Walipini sounded like a freight train driving directly over Nora's head. Inside, her thermometer read a miraculous 68 degrees. The spinach and radishes in her raised beds glowed vibrant green beneath battery-powered LED grow lights. But Nora couldn't sleep. The radio had reported that propane regulator valves were freezing solid across the county, rendering heaters useless. Thomas was out there, alone. In an aluminum can, Nora made a decision that bordered on suicidal. She layered herself in 2 pairs of thermal leggings, a wool sweater, her heavy winter parka, 2 pairs of gloves, and ski goggles. She took a 300-foot spool of heavy-duty nylon paracord, tied one end securely to the steel-reinforced doorframe of the Walipini, and clipped the other to her belt. Pushing the heavy, angled door open against the snowdrift took every ounce of her strength. The moment she stepped onto the surface, the wind hit her with the concussive force of a physical blow. The cold was terrifying. It burned her lungs instantly, the moisture in her nose freezing solid in a fraction of a second. The world was a blinding, roaring whiteout. She knew Thomas's trailer was roughly 200 yards due east, parked near a cluster of old cottonwood trees. Navigating by memory and the faint silhouette of the tree line, she fought her way through waist-deep drifts. Every step was an agonizing battle. Her extremities went numb within minutes. When she finally slammed into the side of the Airstream, the metal was coated in a thick shell of rime ice. There was no smoke coming from the chimney. The propane tanks were completely encased in frozen snow. Nora beat on the aluminum door with her fists. She forced the door handle down, throwing her shoulder against the frozen metal until the seal broke. Inside, the trailer was a meat locker. Frost coated the interior walls and the dead light bulbs. Thomas was slumped on the floor, wrapped in a sleeping bag, his lips a frightening shade of blue. He was shivering violently, slipping rapidly into the severe stages of hypothermia. "Thomas, get up!" Nora grabbed his shoulders. He looked at her with glassy, unfocused eyes. Heater died. Regulator froze. "Too cold, Nora. Just gonna rest." "No, you are not resting." Nora hauled him upward, fueled by a surge of pure adrenaline. She forced a heavy wool coat over his shoulders and zipped it up. "You're coming with me." Now, dragging a 200-pound man through a Category 5 blizzard was a nightmare Nora would never fully remember. She relied entirely on the taut tension of the nylon paracord tied to her belt. They fell repeatedly, buried in the suffocating snow. The wind screamed in their ears, a deafening roar that drowned out everything but the frantic pounding of her own heart. By the time the dark, angled roof of the Walipini appeared through the whiteout, Nora was operating on the very last reserves of her cellular energy. She dragged Thomas down the earthen steps, kicked the heavy door shut, and collapsed onto the dirt floor. The immediate silence was staggering. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the subterranean bunker, it was warm, quiet, and smelling of damp earth and growing things. Nora stripped off Thomas's frozen outer layers, dragging him toward the stone well. She wrapped him in dry thermal blankets and positioned him directly over the geothermal vent, letting the 85-degree steam wash over his shivering body. For 3 hours, she watched his chest rise and fall, boiling snow over her camping stove to make hot tea. Slowly, the blue faded from his lips. When Thomas finally opened his eyes, he looked up at the polycarbonate roof, then at the vibrant green plants surrounding him, and finally at the steaming stone well. He let out a long, ragged breath. "You built a damn good bunker, kid." For the next 9 days, the Siberian Express held Bitter Creek hostage. The snow continued to fall, burying houses to their rooflines. The outside temperature never rose above -20. Inside the Walipini, life settled into a surreal, primitive rhythm. Nora and Thomas survived on the dwarf tomatoes, crisp radishes, and spinach she had painstakingly cultivated. They melted snow over the central well, the geothermal heat functioning perfectly as an endless, fuel-free energy source. They were an island of warmth and life in a frozen ocean of death. Every few hours, Nora would use a long, padded pole to gently tap the underside of the heavy glass roof, causing the accumulated snow to slide down the angled pitch and away from the structure, ensuring the glass wouldn't crack under the immense weight. They listened to the emergency radio as the batteries dwindled. The news was catastrophic. The entire state's infrastructure had collapsed. Emergency services were completely paralyzed. People were freezing to death in their living rooms. Nora looked at the hissing stone well, the useless inheritance her grandfather had left her. It wasn't just keeping them alive, it was thriving. On the morning of the 10th day, the wind finally stopped. The silence was almost as deafening as the storm had been. Nora pushed the Walipini door open, having to dig through 4 feet of snow just to clear the entrance. The sun broke through the grey clouds, reflecting off a landscape that was unrecognizable. Bitter Creek had been erased. Entire homes were buried beneath massive, sculpted drifts of blinding white. Thomas emerged behind her, squinting against the glare. "We need to check on the town," he said quietly. They strapped on snowshoes Thomas had stored in the airstream and began the grueling trek toward the main settlement. The devastation was absolute. Telephone poles were snapped in half. Cars were nothing but mysterious mounds in the snow. They found Brenda Hollis, the real estate agent, huddled in the local community center with about 40 other townspeople. The center had a large fireplace, but they were running dangerously low on chopped wood, and the interior temperature was hovering just above freezing. People were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. The roads were completely impassable. The National Guard wouldn't be able to reach them for days. "Nora?" Brenda gasped, her teeth chattering as she wrapped a thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. "We thought you were dead out on that ridge." "Your place? A glass roof. It must have shattered." "It held," Nora said, her voice carrying across the quiet room. "And it's warm. We have a geothermal well. The ambient temperature is 65 degrees. I have fresh water, and I have some food." The room went dead silent. "How many can you fit?" asked Mayor Higgins, a man who looked to have aged 10 years in a week. "As many as we can squeeze in," Nora replied without hesitation. Over the next 12 hours, Nora and Thomas led a slow, arduous exodus. They brought the most vulnerable first, the elderly, families with young children guiding them along the snowshoe trail back to Parcel 42A. When the townspeople descended the earthen steps and felt the rush of humid, warm air, many broke down in tears. The Walipini, designed for one woman, transformed into a subterranean refugee camp. 50 people huddled around the glowing green beds of the greenhouse, soaking in the life-saving heat radiating from the stone shaft. Nora organized rationing, boiling snow for drinking water and distributing small portions of the harvested vegetables to those who needed it most. It was a miracle born of dirt and desperation. On the third day after the storm broke, a distant, mechanical whine echoed over the frozen ridge. Two high-powered, multi-track search and rescue snowcats were crawling over the drifts, approaching the Walipini. Nora stepped outside to meet them, wrapping a shawl over her shoulders. The lead snowcat idled, and the heavy door popped open. A rescue worker stepped out, followed by a passenger, Nora froze. Stepping into the snow, looking pale, gaunt, and completely defeated, was Derek Pendleton. He was wearing an expensive ski jacket that looked remarkably inadequate. He was shivering, his face drawn and exhausted. Derek had been in the county seat, 30 miles away, secretly meeting with local judges to finalize the litigation to strip Nora of her water rights. When the storm hit, he was trapped in an upscale boutique hotel. The hotel's backup generators had failed on day 2. The multimillionaire CEO of Pendleton Logistics had spent the last week huddled under a mattress, burning hotel furniture in a decorative lobby fireplace, just to stave off frostbite. He had paid the rescue crew an exorbitant amount of cash to evacuate him to the nearest functional helipad, but the crew had insisted on checking the thermal signature they had spotted on their drone sweeps over Bitter Creek first. Derek stared at the structure. He looked at the cleared glass roof, the steam rising from the ventilation pipes, and the crowd of warm, surviving townspeople standing near the entrance. "You're alive," Derek whispered, his voice hoarse. "No thanks to you," Nora replied evenly. Derek took a step forward, his eyes darting to the open door of the Walipini, feeling the rush of warm air spilling out into the freezing Wyoming morning. "My plant, the bottling facility in the south. The storm collapsed, the steel framing, the pipes shattered. Everything is ruined. I lost $12 million in a week. The insurance won't cover acts of God of this magnitude." He looked pathetic. The arrogance that had defined him in the lawyer's office was gone, stripped away by the brutal equalizer of nature. "I'm freezing, Nora," he said, his voice breaking. Nora looked at the man who had mocked her inheritance, who had tried to bankrupt her, who had actively rooted for her failure. She held all the power. She could turn him away. She could leave him to the cold. She looked back into the Walipini. She saw Thomas tending to an elderly woman, serving her hot water steeped with fresh mint leaves. She saw Jimmy and Leo, the boys who had helped her dig the trench, sleeping soundly in the corner. She turned back to Derek. "You can come in," Nora said, her voice carrying the unshakable weight of the earth she had dug. "But you leave your coat, your name, and your money at the door." Derek hesitated, his pride battling his survival instinct. But a violent gust of wind whipped across the ridge, cutting through his clothes. He lowered his head, a silent surrender, and walked past her, descending into the warmth of the dirt patch he had once so casually discarded. For the next 4 days, the hierarchy of the outside world ceased to exist inside the Walipini. Derek Pendleton, the multimillionaire CEO who had once worn $3,000 suits to board meetings, spent his waking hours taking orders from Jimmy and Leo, the 2 local high school dropouts. Blisters the size of quarters formed on his manicured hands as he used a padded push broom to meticulously clear the heavy accumulation of ice off the polycarbonate roof. He ate the same rationed bowls of boiled spinach and salted radishes as everyone else. When he complained about the lack of protein on his second day, Mayor Higgins simply handed him a bucket and told him the makeshift latrine in the upper trench needed emptying. Derek didn't complain again. He worked in a stunned, hollow silentness, his eyes constantly darting to the stone well in the center of the room. He watched how the townspeople huddled around it, treating the hissing geothermal vent with a quiet reverence. It was the heart of their survival, a steady pulse of warmth in a frozen wasteland. By the time the National Guard heavy mechanized units finally breached the snowdrifts on Highway 28, it was late December. The military convoy, composed of massive, plow-equipped transport trucks, rolled into what was left of Bitter Creek. The evacuation of the Walipini was a deeply emotional affair. As the townspeople climbed the earthen steps into the blinding glare of the winter sun to board the heated military transports, nearly every person stopped to embrace Nora. Brenda Hollis pressed a frostbitten hand against Nora's cheek, tears freezing on her eyelashes. "You saved this town, Nora," Brenda whispered. "We won't forget it." Derek was the last to leave. He stood at the threshold of the heavy door, his ruined luxury ski jacket stained with dirt and grease. He looked back at Nora, who was standing beside Thomas, her hands resting on the edge of a flourishing tomato bed. "My lawyers will call you," Derek muttered, his voice lacking its usual venom. "Tell them to save their breath, Derek," Nora replied softly. "You have bigger problems now." She was right. The true devastation of the Siberian Express wasn't just measured in snow depth, it was measured in economic ruin. 2 weeks later, as the unprecedented snowpack finally began to melt under an unseasonably warm January sun, the consequences of Derek's hubris caught up with him. Nora heard the news over the repaired local radio broadcast while sipping hot tea in her subterranean greenhouse. Derek's crown jewel, the sprawling commercial bottling facility 100 miles south, had been built on a floodplain. He had bypassed several environmental zoning warnings, bribing local officials to expedite the permits. When the meltwater surged off the Rockies, the Bitterroot River breached its banks. The floodwaters decimated the facility, submerging the million-dollar bottling machines under 10 feet of muddy, freezing water. Because the facility was built in an uninsurable flood zone without the proper federal waivers, Pendleton Logistics was denied their catastrophic loss claims. Facing massive over-leveraged debt and angry shareholders, the board of directors held an emergency meeting in Denver. Derek Pendleton was unceremoniously ousted as CEO. His accounts were frozen, his Aspen estate was leveraged to pay off angry creditors, and the Pendleton empire, built on a foundation of ruthless corporate raiding, completely evaporated. Meanwhile, on Parcel 42A, a very different kind of reckoning was taking place. The rapid temperature fluctuations and the immense barometric pressure shifts caused by the historic blizzard had triggered minor tectonic settling along the dormant fault line deep beneath Bitter Creek. Thomas Granger had noticed it first. The hissing from the stone well had grown louder, and the ambient temperature in the Walipini had spiked to 88 degrees, forcing Nora to prop open the roof vents just to keep the plants from wilting. Thomas called in a favor from an old colleague, Dr. Harrison Caldwell, a senior geophysicist at the United States Geological Survey. Caldwell arrived in a ruggedized SUV with a team of technicians carrying ground-penetrating radar and thermal mapping drones. For 3 days, the USGS team measured, probed, and mapped the subterranean network beneath Nora's feet. Caldwell finally sat down with Nora and Thomas at a folding table inside the Walipini. His expression was one of profound disbelief. "The storm caused a localized contraction in the limestone bedrock," Caldwell explained, tapping a topographical map covered in red thermal overlays. It essentially cracked the capstone of a massive, high-enthalpy geothermal reservoir situated about 2,000 feet down. "The well your grandfather built acting as a microvent? That was just a pinhole leak. What you have sitting beneath this 2-acre dirt patch right now is a pressurized, high-temperature brine aquifer." Nora stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What does that mean in practical terms, Dr. Caldwell?" "It means you are sitting on a gold mine, Miss Campbell," Caldwell said bluntly. "If tapped correctly with a binary cycle power plant, this reservoir can produce roughly 8 to 10 megawatts of continuous, clean electricity. That is enough to independently power and heat the entire town of Bitter Creek and the neighboring 2 counties, indefinitely." Word of the miracle on Parcel 42 spread rapidly through the energy sector. Within a month, Nora's dirt-cheap flip phone was ringing incessantly. Major green energy conglomerates and state utility companies were offering her tens of millions of dollars to buy the 2 acres of barren Wyoming rock outright. Nora refused them all. She remembered the lawyer's office. She remembered Derek's smirk. She remembered the townspeople huddled around the well, shivering in the dark. Instead of selling, she hired Richard Sterling, the same dry-voiced estate lawyer who had originally read her grandfather's will. Sterling was flabbergasted by the turn of events, but eagerly accepted her retainer. Together, they formed the Bitter Creek Geothermal Cooperative. Nora leased the deep drilling rights to a reputable, community-focused energy firm on a strict, unbreakable 70-year contract. She retained absolute ownership of the land and the Walipini. The terms of the lease were unprecedented. Nora would receive a percentage of the gross revenue generated by the plant, but the firm was legally obligated to provide completely free, subsidized electricity and municipal heating to every single resident within the Bitter Creek town limits. By the following autumn, The landscape of Parcel 42A had transformed. A sleek, low-profile geothermal energy station sat a quarter-mile down the ridge, humming quietly as it converted the Earth's natural heat into sustainable power. The town of Bitter Creek, practically destroyed a year prior, was experiencing an economic boom. Because the town offered free energy, small manufacturing businesses and agricultural startups were flooding into the area, rebuilding the shattered infrastructure into a thriving, modern community. Nora did not move to an Aspen estate. She did not buy a fleet of luxury cars. She kept the Walipini. She expanded it, hiring Jimmy and Leo full-time at a generous wage to help her build 3 more interconnected subterranean greenhouses. She grew organic produce year-round, supplying the local diners and grocery stores with fresh vegetables even when the Wyoming snows buried the roads. She found a quiet, profound peace in the damp earth and the steady, warm breath of the stone well. As for Derek Pendleton, the universe has a distinct, often poetic sense of humor. Bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and unemployable in the high-stakes corporate energy sector, Derek was forced to rely on a few remaining contacts to secure a job. He ended up working as a mid-level regional manager for a discount commercial supply company in suburban Nebraska. He lived in a rented 2-bedroom apartment, drove a leased beige sedan, and spent his days answering angry emails about delayed shipments of paper towels and office furniture. Occasionally, when the winter wind howled against the thin, poorly insulated windows of his apartment, Derek would turn up his thermostat, watching the electric meter spin, painfully aware of the fortune he had mocked, the empire he had lost, and the cousin who had beaten him with nothing but a patch of dirt. In the end, Arthur Pendleton's cruel joke became his only enduring legacy. Derek inherited a financial empire built on paper, easily destroyed by a shift in the wind and his own arrogance. Nora inherited dirt and a dry well, but she built an unbreakable foundation. She proved that true wealth isn't what you are simply given. It is the warmth and life you can pull from the coldest, hardest stones.